Does everyone remember that TBR I put out into the world in ink and on video at the beginning of this month? Yeah, we need to cross that all out, scribble it out in ink, because it is in a shambles. I've read some of the books, and I'm currently working on some, but on the whole, I've sort of abandoned that TBR. I've still been reading, so I have some books I want to talk about, some books I've read, some books I'm working on. So yeah, I'll start with one that I finished, King Harald's Saga by Snorri Sturluson. This is the story of the life of King Harald, essentially, told in a kind of grandiose, sort of not mythical way, but definitely in sort of a very a character-driven style, focusing very closely on just King Harald's personality and his force of personality. And sorry, the cat is behind the camera. Yeah, anyway, I'm going to talk about it more in my Saga long video, so I won't talk about it too much here, but it was very interesting. Perhaps not my favorite, but very interesting. Next, into something I did really enjoy, was Plutarch's Life of Pompey. So Pompey is known in history primarily as the primary rival to Julius Caesar in both of their efforts to become sort of sole ruler of Rome, and to topple the Roman Republic and start an empire. They were both part of a triumvirate, and I can't remember who the third in the triumvirate was. The idea of the triumvirate is sort of a thing that was imposed on what happened, like the Plutarch, Caesar, or Pompey, Caesar, and the third person didn't call themselves the triumvirate. They're just sort of retrospectively been termed the triumvirate by history. But they sort of were these three guys who had most of the power in Rome for a time. And then Julius Caesar and Pompey sort of became the two primary players in this triumvirate, with most of the brains and most of the power. And then they ended up dueling with each other over the Roman Republic, and obviously Caesar ended up winning. But Pompey also, had a life outside of that. He had, that all happened when he was in, like, his 40s, 50s, and 60s, so there was a whole time in his 20s and 30s when he was a very active and accomplished general, fighting for the Roman Republic. Honestly, a big impression of mine coming out of the life of Pompey is that his accomplishments seem to dwarf Caesar's accomplishments, which get a lot more attention. I mean, Caesar conquered Gaul and Britain, I know, but Pompey put down a rebellion in North Africa, put down a rebellion in Spain, and possibly also Sicily, put down the slave revolt led by Spartacus in Italy. He cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, and he also defeated the kings of Armenia and Pontus, which at the time was no small feat. They were both very powerful kingdoms. So yeah, honestly, I kind of came out of this thinking, wow, and Caesar may have defeated Pompey, safely at the Battle of the Pharsalia, but he seems almost to be a more accomplished figure in terms of his military accomplishments. But then just aside from that, in general, with Plutarch, I've now read 3 of his lives, and he's great. I really am liking him. He has a dramatic flair. I mean, his characterizations of the people he's writing about is almost reminiscent of Snorri Sturluson in his Saga. Very personality-driven, very character-driven, and it just heightens my involvement in each of the lives. It just makes me care about what's happening a lot more when the subject seems like a real human being with a personality who I could meet. Whereas sometimes in some of these old historians, the people can, not always, but often seem sort of just names with mouths who talk. And I like it. At the end of Pompey's life, he dies. He's kind of assassinated, actually. He's defeated at the Battle of the Pharsalia, and then he flees. He escapes the onslaught of Caesar and his armies and flees, and ends up in Egypt. And the pharaoh of Egypt at the time, Ptolemy, has sort of a debt to Pompey for a previous engagement where Pompey helped him out. And so Pompey goes to the pharaoh of Egypt hoping that he'll harbor him and help him. But the pharaoh and his advisors decide to just kill Pompey when he comes to them, and it's a very tragic and it's a very moving scene actually when Pompey dies, which I wouldn't have expected because he's not exactly a person who I necessarily have that much sympathy for, being a military leader, and obviously he had as many aspirations to usurp the Roman Republic as Caesar did. But still, I found that scene very moving, and I think part of that is just because Plutarch does a great job characterizing Pompey, and I found that was true with his life of Caesar and his life of Artaxerxes as well. So yeah, I'm liking Plutarch a lot. I don't know, he might turn out to be my favorite of these old historians. He's probably the one I like most so far. I've now read some Herodotus, some Thucydides, and now some Tacitus, and some Boethius, Bede, sorry. And of those that I've read, I think he might be my favorite. So yeah, anyway, got Plutarch, and then the really substantial one, one that I finished last weekend in sort of a frenzy, Don Quixote. I read 200 pages of it all in one day. I was reading pretty much all day last Saturday, and managed to finish this. And I just gotta say, it was one of the most satisfying instances where I've been able to shut a book on the last page. This novel really was a slog for me. It was really hard to get to. I considered not finishing it several times, just because it really doesn't have much of a real plot. It doesn't have an overarching narrative or conflict at all. Basically the only thing to keep you interested is the character of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. And admittedly, they are fascinating characters. I can see now why this novel is supposed to be, the foundation for a lot of modern fiction, because I think Don Quixote himself shows a lot of the symptoms of a modern character who we would see more of later in the 1800s and 1900s and into the 21st century. Except that he shows them, ratcheted up 10 times, because Cervantes was probably one of the first ones to have a modern character in a novel. So I could see how Don Quixote was influential and why it's an important novel. And, the way that Don Quixote sort of is, he's read so many romances that he wants to live romances. That is the butt of a lot of jokes in this novel, but I think we all, to an extent, live like that. We all have some narrative that we think we're living out in our lives. Most of the time that narrative is facile, whether we want to admit it or not. But we sort of have to believe it in order to keep going. And if we don't, we might end up despairing as much as Don Quixote does at the end of this novel. And then there's Sancho Panza, who sort of has a bit of an alternative way of living, where he sort of realizes that it's all kind of absurd and dumb, but sort of goes along with it anyway, because it's fun, or he has nothing better to do, or who really knows. It's hard to say what Sancho Panza's motivations for sticking with Don Quixote are, other than that maybe he likes Don Quixote. Although the way they talk to each other, the banter between them, would seem to suggest that they don't like each other that much. But then again, I think a lot of the conversations that male friends have with each other would give you to believe that they don't like each other very much. Or at least in my experience, my conversations with male friends tend to be very, we bicker like married couples all the time. And so perhaps that's just what Don Quixote is showing. But yeah, it's just a hard novel to stay interested in, because it lacks a sort of overarching narrative drive and any sort of drama. It's just sort of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza wandering around, getting into misadventures for 1,000 pages. So I'm not entirely certain I'm ever going to read it again. Although I won't rule that out, certainly. But I'm glad I read it now. And yeah, and I'm glad I'm finished with it, just because it was such a weight over my head, you know? And I pretty much knew that if I didn't finish it this month, I wasn't ever going to finish it. Because if I hadn't finished it this month, I would have had to put it aside so that I could get through March of the Mammoths. And if I had to put it aside with, 200 pages to go and came out of the March of the Mammoths, I just don't know if I would have had the motivation to continue, because all my momentum would have been gone. So, yeah, anyway, so that's just a big I feel like I didn't do a great job of expressing myself about Don Quixote, but that is a big thought dump on Don Quixote. I'm not going to do a whole video on it, so that's kind of why I took the time to talk about it a bit more in depth. But yeah, anyway, this book might not be for everyone, perhaps. I would venture to argue that it wasn't for me either, although given that I'm just interested in classics and literature in general, and how literature has developed over time, and sort of how previous literature has influenced later literature, it was up my alley in that sense, but it wasn't the type of story I tend to necessarily enjoy. Anyway, so that's Don Quixote. Sorry for the big sort of disconnected rambling about it, but yeah, anyway, we're gonna move on now. Next is the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson, which is the next book after King Harald's Saga for the Saga Long. And this is a book about, I'm like 20 pages in. It's a book about Norse mythology, essentially. It's a collection of their myths, essentially. And I haven't gotten too far into it, so I don't have too much to say about it. But I'm going to be talking about it more in a video, obviously, for Saga Long, so I'm not going to talk about it much more here. But the last one is the one you've seen before. Say it with me now. History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. And yeah, I'm 245 pages in, so I haven't made much progress lately. It's starting to become, I'm not as into it now, because it is just getting into sort of, it sort of feels like Thucydides is just going through the motions, telling the war year by year, battle by battle, campaign by campaign, with certain touch points that are interesting, where, he'll have a great insight into human nature, or into the nature of war, or into the nature of politics, but getting from those touch points that are very interesting through all of the just, sort of year by year, this battle happened, then so-and-so attacked here, then so-and-so attacked there, then this battle happened, and this is how it happened. Getting through all that is a bit hard for me now. But this too, I feel like I should probably finish before March, just because, again, I feel like if I abandon it for March of the Mammoths and then come back to it, all my momentum will be gone, and I won't be able to finish it, so I may just be sort of, this may be the focus of my last week and a half of February's reading, just because I have to, and because I want to, because I can tell that this is a book worth reading, that I'm going to be glad I read it, like with Don Quixote. And I've honestly gotten more out of this in 250 pages than I got out of Don Quixote in 500 pages. It's just because there is a lot of thought-provoking stuff in here, just, insights into human nature and war, and like I said, so yeah, that's why I want to push through and continue with it. So anyway, yeah, Thucydides. And then, so I finished Plutarch's Life of Pompey this morning, so I've already done some reading today, and so I think I'll start my push to finish the Peloponnesian War tomorrow. And so for the rest of today, I want to do some relatively light reading. So I think what I'll do is I'll read some short stuff. So I have Dubliners by James Joyce. This is actually a bind-up of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Dubliners. Dubliners is his first published book, and is one of his four sort of great works that he's known for, Dubliners, Portrait of the Artist, and then Ulysses in Finnegan's Wake. I've been chipping away at Dubliners, just reading one story every few weeks or so throughout this year. And there are 15 stories, I believe, and I only have 4 more. Although the last story is called The Dead, and it's sort of more like a novella. It's like 40 pages long, so it's substantial. So I have a good chunk of this book left, but I might just read 1 or 2, perhaps, short stories in this today. And then I also just recently got in the mail the collected shorter plays of Samuel Beckett. It's been a little while since I've read any new Samuel Beckett, and he's probably my most read author outside of Shakespeare. So, I obviously love him, so, I think I'll enjoy getting back to him. And these plays are like, most of them are like 10, 15 pages at the most. I think the longest one is 35 pages. So none of these are substantial. And they're plays. I mean, plays are always just easier reading because you're just reading the dialogue on the page. So yeah, anyway, just possibly some lighter reading for the afternoon. I also have a romance novel sitting on my shelf. Watching Steve long enough and watching I can't remember her name, but Steeped in Books, that channel. I can't remember the woman who runs that channel's name, but Steeped in Books, she talks about just basically nothing but romances, and I've been watching her channel a lot lately, just because I find her really fun to listen to. And yeah, the more I watch her channel, the more I listen to Steve talk about romances, the more it gets me interested in trying them out. So I have 1 romance novel, and I'm considering maybe reading it this weekend. But don't worry, my brain won't turn to mush. Yeah. So that is what I've read. I feel like this has been a long Friday reads. But here in Iowa, we had kind of a fake spring. It was like in the high 30s the other day on like Wednesday, and now it's back down to like 9 degrees. And this morning it was like -1. So that's all very fun. Walking to the bus stop in that. But other than that, nothing really interesting has happened. I'm just plugging away at my semester. Slowly things are getting a bit busier. But, just sort of going through the motions. Yeah, anyway. So, I will leave you all there and let you go. So, you all have a nice weekend, and happy reading.